There's a particular quality to the hours before dawn that anyone who works the night shift understands instinctively, a thinness in the world, as if the fabric separating day from night, truth from dream, the living from the dead, becomes somehow more permeable. The city transforms during these hours, shedding its daytime persona of noise and commerce and hustle to reveal something older, stranger, more honest underneath. Rashid Khan had been driving a taxi through these liminal hours for 12 years, long enough to develop an intimacy with the city's pre-dawn rhythms that most people would never know. He knew which streets would be empty and which would still have stragglers from nightclubs closing. He knew where the street cleaners worked and where the early morning delivery trucks would block intersections. He knew the locations of the all-night chai stalls where other drivers gathered, and he knew which traffic lights had sensor malfunctions that left you waiting at deserted intersections for no reason. But more than the geography, Rashid understood the psychology of the hours between 3 o'clock and 6 a.m. This was when the city's masks came off. The passengers he picked up during these hours were different from the daytime crowds: fewer performances, fewer pretensions, fewer carefully constructed social personas. People were too tired for deception. Too desperate for dignity. Too caught in their own emergencies or exhaustions to bother with the elaborate theater of normal life. He picked up nurses finishing overnight shifts, their scrubs wrinkled and their eyes distant with the weight of whatever they'd witnessed. He picked up insomniacs who'd given up trying to sleep and decided to be somewhere, anywhere, rather than alone with their thoughts. He picked up people fleeing bad situations, domestic violence, dangerous neighborhoods, relationships that had turned toxic. He picked up hospital visitors who'd been keeping vigil, students who'd studied through the night, airport workers, bakers, cleaners, security guards, the invisible army that kept the city functioning while everyone else slept. And occasionally, though he didn't like to think about it, he picked up people who seemed wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate. People who sat too still. People whose stories didn't quite add up. People who got in his taxi at impossible locations or disappeared without properly exiting. People who left him with the unsettling feeling that he'd just been part of something that didn't follow normal rules. Rashid was 43 years old, married with 2 teenage daughters who thought his job was simultaneously boring and vaguely embarrassing. He'd immigrated to this city 17 years ago from a small town in the north, carrying dreams that had gradually downsized themselves into the more modest goal of steady income and eventual retirement. The taxi wasn't what he'd imagined doing with his life, but it was honest work that paid the bills and required no one's approval but his own. His taxi was a well-maintained sedan, 8 years old but kept meticulously clean. Rashid vacuumed it daily, wiped down the seats, kept air freshener hanging from the rear-view mirror, jasmine scent, which reminded him of his mother's garden. The dashboard held a small photo of his daughters, a GPS unit that was more reliable than the company's app, and a Quranic verse in elegant calligraphy that his wife had given him. Indeed, with hardship comes ease. He'd need to remember that verse tonight. The shift had been quiet so far, unusually quiet even for a Wednesday night bleeding into Thursday morning. He'd had only 3 fares since midnight, a drunk couple arguing in whispers, a hospital worker, and an elderly man visiting his sick wife. Now, approaching 4 a.m., Rashid was parked outside a closed convenience store, sipping tea from his thermos and listening to late-night radio, some call-in show where people discussed their problems with a host who dispensed advice that was either profound or completely useless depending on your perspective. The city around him was holding its breath. Street lights cast pools of yellow-orange illumination onto empty sidewalks. A stray dog trotted past with purpose, heading somewhere only it understood. In the distance, the elevated metro line stood silent and dark, waiting for the first trains that wouldn't run for another hour. The sky was that deep blue-black that comes just before the first hints of dawn, and a thin fog was rolling in from the river, softening edges and blurring boundaries. At 4:18 a.m., Rashid's phone buzzed with the distinctive tone of a ride request. He glanced at the screen. Pickup location was near the old railway bridge on the eastern edge of the city, about 15 minutes away. The destination was Central Hospital. The fare would be decent, enough to make the drive worthwhile. But Rashid hesitated, his finger hovering over the accept button. The railway bridge area had been partially closed for months following an accident. A truck had lost control during monsoon rains and crashed through the barrier, plunging into the ravine below. The driver had died. The bridge had been deemed structurally sound, but the city had closed the surrounding access roads for safety assessments that seemed to drag on indefinitely, stuck in the bureaucratic limbo that plagued all municipal projects. People still used the area. There were residential neighborhoods nearby that needed access, but it had acquired an uncomfortable reputation. Too quiet. Too isolated. The kind of place where bad things could happen to a lone taxi driver and no one would witness it. Rashid had a rule about refusing rides to areas that felt dangerous, but this was different. The destination was a hospital, which suggested legitimate urgency. The time was early enough that criminals would likely be asleep. And he'd driven worse areas without incident. He accepted the request. The drive took him through increasingly empty streets, the city thinning out as he moved from commercial districts to industrial zones to the shabby residential area surrounding the railway bridge. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility and creating halos around the sparse street lights. His headlights cut pale tunnels through the gray mist, illuminating nothing but more fog and the cracked asphalt of roads that hadn't been properly maintained in years. The GPS guided him to a spot just before the bridge itself, a stretch of road where the old railway infrastructure loomed overhead, massive concrete pillars supporting steel tracks that hadn't seen a train in decades. The area was scheduled for demolition and redevelopment, but like so many city projects, it existed in a state of perpetual postponement. Rashid pulled over and checked his app. Passenger location confirmed. He was in the right place. But there was no one there. Just fog. Just the flickering street light overhead, its bulb struggling against some electrical fault, casting unstable illumination that made shadows jump and retreat. Just the bridge pillars rising like ancient monuments to a forgotten purpose. Just silence broken only by the distant sound of his engine idling and the faint drip of condensation from the overhead tracks. Rashid checked the time, 4:33 a.m. 15 minutes since he'd accepted the ride. Maybe the passenger had given up and found another way. Maybe it was a prank request. Teenagers sometimes did that, calling taxis to random locations as a joke. Maybe. The rear door opened. Rashid's heart jumped. He hadn't seen anyone approach. Hadn't heard footsteps. The rearview mirror showed only fog, but when he turned his head to look directly, there was a young woman settling into the back seat. She was perhaps 25, dressed in a pale blue coat that looked expensive but was soaked through, as if she'd been standing in heavy rain despite the fact that it hadn't rained tonight. Her hair, dark, shoulder-length, was plastered to her head and neck, water still dripping from the ends. Her skin was unusually pale, almost luminous in the dim interior light of the taxi. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead rather than at him. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but clear, with an educated accent that suggested good schools and comfortable upbringing. "Central Hospital, please." There was something wrong. Rashid felt it immediately, viscerally, in the way the temperature in the taxi seemed to drop several degrees, in the way his skin prickled with goosebumps, in the way some ancient survival instinct was screaming at him to reject this fare, to tell her the taxi was broken, to drive away immediately. But he was a professional. He'd driven thousands of passengers, many of them strange in various ways. Unusual didn't mean dangerous. And she was just a young woman needing to get to a hospital at an odd hour, probably visiting a sick relative, probably having walked through the fog, which would explain why she looked damp. "Central Hospital," Rashid confirmed, engaging the meter and pulling away from the bridge. "Emergency?" "Yes," she said simply, and offered nothing more. Rashid tried to observe her through the rearview mirror as he drove, a habit developed over years of needing to assess passengers' states: drunk, angry, unstable, dangerous. But when he glanced at the mirror, he saw only the empty back seat. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. He blinked hard, thinking his eyes were playing tricks, that the fog and the early hour were distorting his vision. He adjusted the mirror slightly, changed its angle. Still nothing. The back seat appeared completely empty in the reflection. But when he turned his head to look directly over his shoulder, she was there, sitting exactly as before, hands folded, staring straight ahead with an expression of profound calm that was itself unsettling given that she was soaking wet at 4:30 in the morning heading to a hospital emergency room. Rashid faced forward again, his mouth dry, his heart rate accelerating. There were rational explanations, he told himself. The mirror's angle was wrong. His eyes were tired. The lighting was strange. He wasn't actually seeing what he thought he wasn't seeing. But the temperature in the taxi remained cold despite the heater running. And when he looked at the passenger seat beside him, he noticed condensation forming on the window as if from breath or body heat, except it was forming in the back, behind him, in patterns that looked almost like someone had pressed their face against the glass. "You okay back there?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain steady and professional. "Yes," she replied. "Thank you for stopping." Most don't. There was something in how she said it, most don't, that made Rashid's skin crawl. As if she'd tried to get rides before. As if she was used to being passed by. As if she was grateful for this basic act of service in a way that suggested she'd been desperate. "Rough night," he ventured, trying to keep the conversation normal, trying to anchor himself in ordinary taxi driver small talk even as everything in his nervous system was insisting this situation was anything but ordinary. She was silent for a long moment. Then, "It was my last." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning Rashid didn't want to examine. The taxi felt smaller suddenly, the fog outside pressing against the windows, the city strangely absent despite being all around them. He wanted to ask what she meant but was terrified of the answer. They drove in silence. Rashid focused on the road, on the familiar route to Central Hospital, on the ordinary mechanical process of driving, accelerate, brake, turn signal, check mirrors, though checking mirrors was now complicated by the fact that one passenger appeared and disappeared depending on how he looked. The hospital came into view after what felt like both seconds and hours, a sprawling complex of buildings lit up like a small city within the city, its emergency entrance marked by harsh fluorescent lights and the distinctive red cross. An ambulance was parked at the bay, its lights dark, presumably between calls. As Rashid slowed the taxi, approaching the hospital entrance, the young woman finally moved, turning her head to look at him. In the rearview mirror, which now, suddenly, showed her reflection perfectly clearly, their eyes met. "My brother is in the emergency ward," she said, her voice carrying a weight of sorrow so profound it seemed to physically press against Rashid's chest. "He doesn't know yet." "Know what?" The question escaped before Rashid could stop it, even though part of him absolutely did not want to know the answer. Her eyes, dark, infinite, filled with something that might have been regret or might have been peace, held his gaze. "That I didn't make it." The taxi rolled to a complete stop. Rashid's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Very slowly, barely breathing, he turned fully in his seat to look at the back. Empty. The seat where she'd been sitting showed no indentation. No dampness despite her soaked coat. No trace of anyone having been there at all. The rear door was closed and, when Rashid reached back to check it, locked from the inside. He sat frozen, his mind refusing to process what had just happened, trying to construct rational explanations that wouldn't hold together, that fell apart under the weight of what he'd experienced. Hallucination. Exhaustion. Stress. Something in the tea he'd been drinking. Anything except the obvious, impossible truth that he'd just driven a passenger who wasn't alive. His phone buzzed, the sound shocking in the silent taxi. He looked at the screen. Trip completed. Payment received. 320 Indian rupees. The app showed the route he'd just driven, from the railway bridge to Central Hospital, with a rating request for the passenger. As if it had been a normal fare. As if he'd just completed an ordinary journey. Rashid sat outside the hospital for 20 minutes, unable to make himself drive away, unable to make himself go inside, paralyzed between disbelief and a terrible certainty. Finally, he got out of the taxi and walked into the emergency entrance, not sure what he was doing or what he expected to find. The emergency ward was doing what emergency wards do, humming with controlled chaos, nurses moving with purposeful efficiency, doctors conferring in serious tones, the universal hospital smell of disinfectant and anxiety thick in the air. Rashid approached the reception desk where a tired-looking nurse was updating records on a computer. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rough from not speaking. I'm looking for information about an accident. From tonight. Near the railway bridge." The nurse looked up, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to something sadder. "The siblings," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Rashid nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was nodding to. "We lost her at the scene," the nurse said, her voice dropping even lower. "The young woman. She died on impact," the paramedics said. "Her brother survived, he's in surgery now. Critical but stable. He doesn't know yet about his sister. We're waiting until he's more stable before." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. "What was?" Rashid's voice cracked. "What was she wearing?" The nurse consulted her screen. According to the report, pale blue coat. She was on her way to visit family at this hospital when the accident happened. Rashid sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs lining the wall, his legs suddenly unable to support him. Around him, the emergency ward continued its routines, oblivious to the fact that he'd just had every assumption about the nature of reality fundamentally shaken. He'd driven a ghost. Had sat in a car with someone who'd died hours earlier. Had been chosen, for reasons he couldn't begin to understand, to give her one last ride, to bring her to the place where her brother was fighting for his life, to grant her some final moment of witnessing or farewell or closure. Rashid drove home as the sun was rising, painting the fog golden and burning it away to reveal the ordinary city underneath. His shift was over. He parked his taxi, walked into his apartment where his wife and daughters were still sleeping, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, trying to reconcile what had happened with any framework of understanding he possessed. He never drove that route again. Rashid didn't tell anyone about the 418 passenger. Not his wife, who would have worried and insisted he see a doctor or a religious scholar. Not his fellow drivers, who would have either mocked him or spread the story until it became distorted and sensational. Not his daughters, who were at an age where they found their father's world simultaneously boring and embarrassing and certainly didn't need reasons to think he was losing his mind. He kept it inside, a private weight he carried alone. But the experience changed his relationship with the taxi, with the night shift, with the city itself. He found himself paying attention to things he'd previously ignored, the way certain intersections felt colder than they should, the way some streets seemed to attract more fog than others, the passengers who sat too still or looked too lost or asked to go to places that didn't quite make sense. He became a collector of strange stories, listening when other drivers shared their own unsettling experiences. And there were more of them than he'd realized. The industry folklore of taxi drivers contained dozens of tales of unusual passengers, impossible fares, rides that shouldn't have happened. There was Ahmed, who'd picked up an elderly man at a cemetery who'd asked to be taken home, then vanished from the taxi before arrival. There was Fatima, who'd driven a teenage girl to her parents' house only to learn later that the girl had died in that house 3 years earlier. There was Vikram, who transported a businessman to an office building that had been demolished months before. Some of these stories were probably exaggerated. Some were probably misremembered or embellished with each retelling. But some, and Rashid knew this with certainty now, were true. The city was older and stranger than its modern facade suggested. The boundaries between worlds were thinner than people wanted to believe. And taxi drivers, operating in those liminal hours, became accidental witnesses to whatever existed in the spaces between. 6 months after the incident, Rashid was working his usual shift when another request came through at 4:18 a.m. His finger hovered over the accept button, and for a long moment he considered letting it time out. He developed a habit of avoiding requests that came exactly at that time, a superstitious boundary that made him feel slightly more in control. But this one was different. The pickup location was a hospital, the destination a residential address. And something, intuition, compulsion, the sense that he'd been chosen for this work, made him accept. The passenger was an older woman, very much alive, exhausted from a night keeping vigil over her sick husband. She needed to go home, shower, change clothes, eat something before returning for the next shift of worry. She was ordinary. Grateful for the ride. Exactly the kind of passenger Rashid had transported thousands of times. As he drove, Rashid found himself talking to her, asking gentle questions, offering the kind of comfort that came from years of witnessing human struggle. And when they arrived at her home, she thanked him with such genuine warmth that he felt something in his chest ease slightly. "You're a kind man," she said. "I can tell. You actually see people." After she left, Rashid sat in his taxi and understood something he hadn't quite articulated before. He'd been chosen not just to drive the ghost, but to continue driving everyone. To see the people who needed to be seen. To provide small moments of dignity and kindness to those moving through the city in its darkest hours. His job wasn't just transportation. It was witnessing. It was holding space for whatever journey people needed to make, whether they were going somewhere or, like his 418 passenger, saying goodbye. Not every journey is about arrival. Some are about closure. Some are about bearing witness. Some are about the simple act of being present for someone who needs to be seen, even if that someone no longer exists in the way we typically understand existence. Rashid Khan learned this truth in the most unsettling way possible, but the lesson applies to all of us. We are constantly surrounded by people on journeys we don't fully understand, carrying burdens we can't see, heading toward destinations that might not be physical places at all. The easy response is to remain oblivious. To treat everyone as means to ends, the taxi driver as transportation, the cashier as transaction facilitator, the nurse as medical service provider. To move through the world sealed in our own concerns, barely registering the humanity of those we encounter. But Rashid's story suggests a different possibility, that being present, truly present, for others' journeys, even when we don't understand them, even when they're strange or uncomfortable or frightening, is itself a form of grace. He didn't have to accept that 418 request. Could have let it time out, avoided the strange area, prioritized his own comfort and safety. And his life would have been less complicated, less unsettling, less haunted by questions he can't answer. But he also would have missed something profound, the opportunity to provide a final kindness to someone who desperately needed it. To be the vehicle, literally and metaphorically, for a closure he didn't understand but that clearly mattered. How many opportunities do we miss because we're not paying attention? How many people around us are on journeys toward their own forms of closure, their own necessary endings, their own attempts to say goodbye or make peace or witness one last time whatever they need to witness? Your colleague who's been quiet lately might be processing grief. The stranger on the bus might be heading to say goodbye to a dying parent. The person serving you coffee might be holding together a life that's falling apart in ways you'll never know. And your presence, your genuine, attentive, compassionate presence, might be the only kindness they encounter that day. Might be the thing that helps them get through whatever they're trying to get through. Might be, in ways you'll never fully know, a small grace in a difficult journey. This doesn't mean you need to fix everyone's problems or take on burdens that aren't yours to carry. But it means showing up. Being present. Seeing people as people rather than functions. Holding space for whatever they're experiencing without needing to understand or explain or categorize it. Rashid didn't understand what happened that morning. Still doesn't. Probably never will. But he accepted the request. He provided the service. He witnessed what needed to be witnessed. And that was enough. That's always enough, to show up, to be present, to provide whatever small kindness the moment requires. Because not every journey is about getting somewhere. Some journeys are about being accompanied. Some are about being seen. Some are about having someone bear witness to your passage, even if that passage is from one state of being to another that defies easy explanation. So pay attention. Be present. See the people around you as people on journeys you don't fully understand. Hold space for their experiences without needing to explain or fix or categorize them. And maybe, when it's your turn to need witnessing, someone will be there to provide that same grace for you. Be story wise.